Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. In today's video, we're going to take a look at API management. This is the next video in my series about understanding Azure costs. So we'll start by having a look at an example of what does APIM look like if you've got this set up in the real world. So here we've got an example of APIM on the classic tier. So this has been around for a while, and there's a number of different API management resources across a number of environments. And I think that the first thing to probably point out here, I'm looking at by service name. So we've got API management, and also I've included log analytics costs here because I think most people who are using API management are going to connect it to App Insights, which will then connect it to log analytics. So anytime you use an API management, you'll probably have a degree of log analytics costs as well. So you can notice here the API management costs at the service name level, they're fairly static. So that's taking advantage of the predictable per hour costs. But you'll notice there's little spikes in some of the log costs where they're obviously, variances in the amount of traffic means you'll sometimes get more cost on one day versus the next. Now, if we now take a look at by meter, so what's quite interesting is in this case there's developer premium tiers of API management. I think there might even be a standard tier if I remember right as well, but the key thing to note is by meter we've got the premium unit and the secondary unit. So these are the two costs on the premium tier because they have two nodes on this service. So we've got the primary data center, and then they've got a second node in a different region. But you pay a slightly cheaper price for that secondary node. So you'll notice here the cost for the second node's cheaper than the cost for the primary node, and then this data ingestion cost I think will be the meter for log analytics. So it's just looking at the previous graph by meter instead of by service name. Now, if we look at this graph's wider environments, I think in the previous graph it's probably just looking at the production environment. The wider environment's looking across all of the different environments. So now we have the premium and secondary units that we had previously, but in their dev and test environment, the dev and test environments, you can see they've got standard and developer. So here's the developer cost. Here's the standard cost. This one's the premium secondary, and that's the premium primary. So you can see there's quite a big difference between these tiers. The big positive though is it's really predictable because they're all per hour. So there's at the scale in this scenario, it's a very predictable and reliable cost. Okay, so we'll move into the pricing now. So with API management, the key thing to remember is there's two tiers for API management now. So we have the classic tier, which has been around for a number of years, and we've got the V2 tiers that are relatively new. Now, obviously the V2 tiers, they haven't been out as long and they haven't got as many options in terms of the different types of tiering available. So I think this throws up a couple of questions. Now, I guess if you're new, start on API management, if you're at the right scale, you're probably going to jump into either basic or standard. At the minute, premium's in preview, so I think you're probably not going to necessarily use that unless you're unless your attitude to risk is pretty aggressive, you're probably going to not use that in production yet. But if we notice the things like the big one for me, I think really on here is that the standard tier supports VNet integration for $700 a month. That's considerably cheaper than you were able to do that with the V1 tiers, because that required you to have the premium SKU, which was quite expensive. So that's probably the biggest difference in terms of impact for customers. Now, I think the other thing to note is probably that these don't support self-hosted gateways yet, so they're all showing as no. And I know a lot of customers still use self-hosted gateways, and maybe they're hosting the gateway inside an AKS instance or something like that. The other thing that's probably worth noting as well is so on these V2 tiers, in addition to the flat rate, there's also an allowance of API requests per month on those smaller tiers, and then you'll pay per request when you go beyond that. So it's quite interesting that, because that means that those fairly static costs at scale might be a bit less predictable. But I guess the benefit is you can probably scale up the number of nodes quite a lot better than maybe on the V1 tiers to be able to scale for dynamic demand. If we look at the classic tiers now, so here we've got quite a wide range of pricing. So I think one thing to notice on the V2, there wasn't a developer SKU, and there's not a consumption SKU. So these two here were really popular with people for either very ad hoc workloads for consumption, so when you just want to pay per request, but also that developer SKU was really good for people. It's very low cost for a dev scenario. I guess the pricing's not hugely different. I think, so if we go back one, so 150 a month versus 50 a month. So for many people that might be bearable, but I think we've got to expect that V2 will eventually have a developer tier. So the standard and premium tiers, there's not a huge amount of difference, and also the basics quite compatible cost-wise between the two. I think the key thing for me on the pricing is you don't have that on these tiers. You don't have that extra consumption charge. So I would assume you would start throttling, and then you would scale out to another node, which would then give you a multiplier of that per unit cost. Whereas I guess in V2, I assume the way it's going to work. Let's have a look if there was a little caveat even on here. Yeah, so you've got to scale out for an additional unit. So I guess that's three parameters, really, isn't it? You've got the primary unit to scale out for an additional unit, but then you've got an allowance of APIM calls as well. So it's three parameters really to think about there. Now, I think the key one here is VNet support was only really on the developer and the premium SKU, so that really was one of the challenges that made APIM a lot more expensive. But you'll notice there's also quite a lot of other costs come into play. Quite a lot of other features come into play that haven't really been sort of put down on the pricing table for the V2 tiers yet. So I think there'll be more coming in that space as we go through time. Now, what I wanted to do next was talk about some of the considerations and optimizations that we have to think about for APIM. So we've talked already a little bit about what the APIM costs are made up of. So usually it's going to be that fixed price per hour for the host, but obviously the V2 tiers have that additional per request charge when you go beyond a threshold. So that means that one of the key factors when I'm thinking about how much it's going to cost is going to be how many requests will I have. The second factor is also going to be how long will my requests take. So if we think about that from a scalability perspective, if I get say 1,000 requests per second, and if my requests take a fraction of a second, I'm going to get much better throughput than if my 1,000 requests take 30 seconds each. So that all comes down to how many scale units you're going to need to scale out to be able to accommodate the load. So really here what we want to make sure is in order to maximize my APIM throughput, which will minimize my APIM costs, I need to think about these requests that are going through it and to make sure the backends accommodate a good performance level. Now, the next thing we should think about is how many APIMs do I actually have? And I think it's interesting, we've talked about this at a few of the conferences recently. So bizarrely, a lot of companies seem to have a huge number of APIM instances. I guess the scenarios could be different teams have their own instance of API management. different environments have API management, and I think there's been a bit of a transition away, I guess, from one central API management being the kind of central hub to a more sort of decentralized model where there's multiple API management instances. Now, I know one of the aims of the workspace feature in API management is to try and make it so that you can have an element of decentralization while still having the benefits of centralization. So I think the feature reasons for doing that maybe aren't as big as what they used to be, but I think there's a lot of people have APIM out there all over the place, and kind of being able to consolidate that's a good way to reduce your costs, because obviously there's a pretty big cost for each APIM instance. The next thing's the classic versus V2 tier option. So I guess over time there's going to be a stronger preference for new people starting with API management to move to start with V2, especially once that premium SKU comes in as a GA instead of a preview. The question might be more, what do classic people do in terms of migrating to V2? And I'm sure there'll be, you'll probably have to spin a project up and do a little bit of regression testing and a bit of migration work to be able to do that. I think the key thing, the costs are fairly similar. So it's probably more about features and the actual migration effort than there being a compelling reason to migrate purely for cost. Now, when I'm choosing the SKU that I'm on, so let's say we're on V1 because there's no consumption or dev at the minute. I assume they'll come in V2 in due course, but consumption's really going to be either those very dynamic workloads where we want a consumption cost model because the load changes all the time. Dev makes sense for dev environments, so that's a bit of a no-brainer. But then the question becomes, what about other environments and things like production? So in production, it's going to come down to things like which are the right features that I need. Do I need network integration? Do I need certain performance characteristics or availability characteristics? Would choose between standard and premium. And then I guess in your non-prod environment, one of the challenges with Classic was very much that if I had VNet integration requirements, then it meant that I either had to have developer or premium in my UAT environment, which is quite challenging for some customers because you need some middle ground where you get better performance than dev, but not the price of production. So I think that's one of the benefits of that V2 tier where I can have the standard APIM with VNet integration at a much cheaper price. That's a big tick in the box for us there. Now, the next question is going to be things like how do we want to do the hosting? So when you get an APIM instance, you'll obviously have the Azure hosted gateway, but some customers do put a self-hosted gateway as well. And some of the scenarios will be things like I've got an AKS, so I want to put my gateway inside the AKS cluster, and then I can manage my APIs inside the cluster and between my components is a scenario I've seen a few times. Now the V2, I think it said earlier on the table that they don't support the gateway yet, but I assume that's going to come in due course. And I guess the question from an architecture perspective is, do you want your own self-hosted gateway? Do you want to use the Azure gateway? If you have the self-hosted one, you kind of really have both anyway. So it's a question of, do you want to use one versus the other, and how are you going to route your traffic? And are there certain APIs you'd put on the self-hosted gateway and others you'd put on the cloud gateway? So there's a few design choices there. But if you choose that self-hosted gateway, you're going to have that additional cost for that gateway. Now, I think an interesting one, scale up versus scale out, is quite an interesting consideration to think about. So I think when I was looking at this, I was looking at the classic tier, but I think the V2 tier is probably the same. Now, the idea being, based on the load that I can process with an individual SKU with one node, if my load increases, do I scale up to a premium node or do I scale out to a standard node? Scale out to two nodes. Now, I think in the case of standard on classic, 2 standard nodes is cheaper than 1 premium node. So in that case, scaling out would be better way of increasing my throughput to without having to increase my costs as much as if I went up to premium. So I think remember that there's 2 ways you can scale this, and there's also configuration I mentioned over here on the optimization. So we'll call that out now. There are rules where you can configure auto scaling, so you can you can kind of inflate and deflate, and that'll again be more aware of the costs there, especially deflating when you don't need to have that extra node's good. Now, locations such as availability zone and redundancy scenarios, again, that could influence the features that you choose, and that would influence the SKU that you're going to choose for APIM. So you need to think about which SKU would provide the right choices. We also have other advanced scenarios, like if you have Defender for APIs or API Center. While they might be separate to the core cost of API management, they'll be part of your API management solution overall. So don't forget that you're potentially going to have extra costs coming into play, and I think you need to kind of think about how they would factor into your architecture and factor them into your cost planning. Now, if we come to optimizations, the first one would be logins. So we mentioned earlier how with API management, there's going to be an element of your costs going to go on log analytics because you'll have App Insights integration for monitoring the API usage. So here we need to think about how much are we going to log. So in API management, you've got those settings where you can control, do you record inbound, outbound messages? Do you include message bodies? What headers do you include? So basically, the more you log, the more you're going to pay. So I think it's a good idea to really be careful about, let's not log all the time. Let's sometimes you might not have logging turned on at all. Other times you might only do it with sampling, or you only do it for headers and not message bodies. So think about the cost impact of that, especially if you've got a high load API. I think I've spelled that wrong. I think there should be an E in there somewhere. So caching is going to be good for your API. So the first thing is, depending on the SKU that you have, some will have internal caching and some will have the option to have an external cache. So if you choose an external cache, that'll add an additional cost for a Redis cache that you would connect to your API management. But that caching behaviors can benefit your API by giving you better throughput, so you're not always going to the back-end service, which would mean you would process requests quicker. And the quicker you process requests, the more you'll be able to process over a given period of time. That'll then reduce the likelihood of you having to scale. So, caching where you can is a good option. I think we talked a little bit about the developer SKU for non-prod. So again, if you've got a non-prod environment, maybe you're going to use standard, but the challenge is when you have that network and integration. So if we can use the developer SKU for non-prod, then you'll get some benefits that you won't have to buy a premium. Rate limiting policies can be good for cost as well. So here what we're doing is, if we've got noisy neighbors using our APIs and taking up a lot of bandwidth by making a lot of calls, that can increase the likelihood we have to scale. So therefore, if we can limit how much people can use the API, we reduce the likelihood of scaling, and that reduces the chance of our costs increasing by adding another node. I guess this is very similar to the back end scenario as well. So while we're restricting the access to the API, the better the back end API that sits behind API management. It's the exact same scenario, better throughput, quicker latency, reduced likelihood of scaling up. Now, the next one I think is again about the other resources. So if we go beyond log analytics integration, often in an API management solution, you have some other resources that are involved in the architecture. So it's very common for people to put front door or app gateway in front of API management for various reasons. And then often if you have one of those solutions, you might put a WAF in there as well. So don't forget to consider that they're going to be part of the cost of your overall API management solution. It's not just about purely the APIM SKU. So, what you might find is that if you've planned your costs just for APIM and suddenly you have that WAF requirement, that might bring in the front door. You might get some benefits off it because obviously things like the CDN and stuff can be used for certain scenarios and other rules, but that WAF cost and front door cost's not insignificant. So that could actually, if you haven't planned for it, that could affect the budget you've got. And then I think the final one I think is probably worth noting is that it's not uncommon people might change the SKU so that you can optimize environments, and that obviously takes time to do it. So just factor that in if you're going to be dynamically redeploying stuff and modify and optimize for cost. That APIM is not one of those quick solutions where you can just tune the knob and done. It often takes like a good 45 minutes for some of them. I think V2 might be a bit quicker compared to Classic, but just factor that in. If you build that dynamic DevOps process to optimize cost, you do have to factor in the time it takes to do it. Hopefully there's some useful insights for people in today's video, and thank you for listening.